Hello, good evening, good afternoon. My name is Paul Flora. I'm the Deputy Director of the Institut français d'Israël. Very pleased to welcome you tonight, either on Zoom or in flesh and in person at the Institut, our first event open to the public for now a very long time. So I'm very glad we can achieve this. We're pleased tonight to speak about a very important topic, which is how to make artificial intelligence a less biased tool. This event is part of a series we're organizing now for a year raising awareness among the general public on these specific issues. For today's debate, we have the pleasure to welcome two distinguished specialists, Aude Bernheim and Flora Vincent. So Aude is a scientist in microbial genetics at the French National Institute of Health and Medical Research in Paris. She will be giving the talk remotely from France. And the second speaker, Flora Vincent, is here with us tonight. She is a scientist specializing in marine microbiology. She currently works at the Weizmann Institute in Israel. They are both passionate about the interface between science, gender issues, society, design and digital technology. They founded together the WACS Science Association, whose action is focused on making science accessible to everyone. Artificial intelligence remains a vague concept for non-experts, and it was rather vague to me, and I guess it's also vague to most of our participants tonight. So you could ask yourself, why is it so urgent to discuss and to talk about artificial intelligence? Well, because this technology actually has an impact on every one of us on a daily basis. Indeed, AI already serves as decision-making system in multiple fields. And a biased AI could, with poorly calibrated algorithm, can actually discriminate some social groups. For instance, women, and we will be talking about this just in a minute. But it also in the field of work, for instance, where candidates do not have equal opportunity to get a job with similar qualifications. Also in the banking system, people with the same income are more likely to be granted a mortgage than some people are more likely to be granted a mortgage than others, even if they have the same income. Or even in the field of justice, where AI can condition the release of prisoner based on some racial or other issues. So repercussions are numerous. Then it's not very obvious, the connection between artificial intelligence and the gender issue is not really obvious, and it wasn't to me, because how can algorithm behind AI can affect human beings, and especially women? If algorithm are a series of instructions given to machine to perform tasks, aren't they supposed to be rational and objective? Well, it's what we could expect from robots, for instance. Like a robot is a robot, and it will behave the same with the man or with the woman. But actually, it's not the case, and we'll see why. Why AI tends to reproduce the bias we know and which exists in our society. So Aude and Flora address all of these questions in a book entitled Artificial Intelligence Not Without Her, or in French, Intelligence Artificielle Pas sans Elle. The book was published in French in March 2019. Unfortunately, it doesn't exist yet in English, but we hope at least we're looking forward to a translation soon. At the genesis of the book is their ambition to explore how feminism can influence scientific questioning and as well as technological innovation. And they will discuss tonight with us what is it possible to do in order to work toward a better AI likely to impact positively our society. So as you have understood, it's a mixed event, both on Zoom and physically. I start with a few rounds of questions to our two participants, two panelists. The idea is to open the floor to all of your questions. So first, from the room and also from the participants on Zoom. So please ask your questions through the Q&A button on the bottom of your screen, and I take the question afterwards. So to begin with, I'd like to ask you, both of you, you're primarily biologist experts. When we speak about AI, we usually deal with men, and this is an issue you will probably certainly talk about in just a couple of seconds. But we also usually deal with computer scientists or this kind of people. So as biologists, what made you want to bring awareness on this specific issue of AI and gender basis in artificial intelligence?
Aude, you want to start? Should I start? Okay. I can't hear you, Aude. Maybe you're on mute.
Yeah, I said you can start and I can follow.
Yeah, so it's very funny because in general, people always ask us about how it feels to be a biologist talking about AI, but they never ask us how it feels to be a biologist talking about gender, as if it's much more obvious that we can talk about gender, but not about AI, even though probably Aude and I are actually more, let's say, trained to talk about AI because in a specific way, we both use it in our daily jobs. So that's an interesting bias that I often pick up in questions. But to come a bit backwards, when Aude and I decided to create wax and led wax for 4 or 5 years in France, we really had this idea, of course, to promote a fun and accessible science, but also really to try and understand how the impact and the presence of more diversity in science in general can make it better. So we not only interrogated AI, we actually initially more started with the field of health, which is also crazy, full of really core scientific biases in the way that we actually ask scientific questions, collect data, analyze the data, present the results. So we started having all this thinking around it. And at some point we met editors from this collection. So the book is published in a French collection called Égal à Égal, which is actually the only French collection in France fully dedicated to topics around sex and gender in general. So really very broad. And they didn't have anything about biases in science, about really core sex and gender biases in science. So we started initiating this conversation. And because it was such a broad topic, they actually suggested to us to start by focusing on one specific topic. We had different ideas in mind. We had health, we had environment, we had AI, and it's actually by also, by looking at the general context, how AI was starting to be so, pervasive in our daily basis that we said, okay, if we need to focus on something to start with, let's focus on that. And actually, you said very rightly in your introduction that it was vague to you. What were the connections between AI and maybe sex and gender? And actually, it was very vague for us too. And that was mostly the goal was to really, we had a very scientific approach. And this is where I think that our training as scientists really helped to write that book, because we really asked questions. We really asked, okay, great, there is AI on one side, this very dominant technology that is basically in every field of our lives. And there is, on the other hand, half of the population in the world. How do they interact? First, do they interact? If they do interact, how do they interact? At what level? What are the causes, consequences? So we really had an actually very methodic approach in the way we tackled it. And I guess that definitely our scientific background in a way can be really seen in how the book and the ideas develop, because everything is based on a lot of studies also. We base most of the book on scientific papers. And reports. So I think this is also why we kind of decided to jump into that topic.
Yes, and if I can add something, I think the subject of AI came so we started thinking about the book in 2016, 2017. And at that time, I think the editors really had in mind that we would talk about the absence of women in that field. But Flora and I thought that this was such a great opportunity to actually go super deep into the approach that she mentioned, which is to study the biases that can exist in technology. And AI was particularly interesting in the fact that these biases were quite, I would say, quickly demonstrated. And a lot of papers appeared in 2015, 16, 17. And this was in the scientific literature. But we felt that, at least in France, it was not yet within the public debate. And for us, we were really at the stage where we as scientists, we are able to read the science, to understand it. And then because of our experience with wax science and kind of doing popularization of complex topics, we were at this kind of perfect roundabout where we had like feminism, AI, and the capacity to kind of transmit these ideas that were for now still within the scientific field and not yet within the public debate. And I think we really published the book at the same time that these kind of questions also emerged in France. And so we didn't expect it, but it really received a really super, nice welcome. And people were extremely interested. And I think it's because it came at that time and we really had the effort of explaining like the science and how these kind of things were studied.
So you mentioned the absence of women in the field. So just before we go super deep into all the bias that exists, actually, in the book, you explain that historically, the programming was a sector with a lot of women, and there is the historical figure of Ada Lovelace and others. How do you explain the turnaround in the 80s where all the women just vanished and the field was massively invaded by men and taking control by men? To control of all of this, and now it's the natural reaction of everyone. Unfortunately, like computer sciences and AI, it's mental.
Yes. So Flora, I don't know if you can see, but I shared a couple of slides that we had already prepared, and pretty much that's what we explain in the book is that. Women, when we think about women in AI and computer scientists, computer scientists, I think most of the people think about a man. And it's quite ironic because it was one of the science that had its beginning at more females than many other scientific fields. And women had several types of roles. So we said that they were both pioneers, and I guess a lot of you had heard about Ada Lovelace, who is now celebrated for being among the first one, or maybe the first one to actually develop a program. But there are also what we call foot soldiers in the book. So by foot soldiers, we mean that the picture I'm showing in the middle is called the harem of Pickering, and it's because a lot of the work required some calculus, like in physics or in many different disciplines, to be done. And at that time, we didn't have computers, so it was done by hand. And because you could pay women much less than men, and this was seen as kind of an easy task, a lot of women were doing this. And so in this lab of Mr. Pickering, who was working in Harvard, well, he was hiring mostly women to do this type of work. So they were always there. And pretty much what happened is that when the transition came from doing this calculus by hands to computers, at the beginning, it was really seen more as something like for women, in the sense that the same way that if I tell you about cable women, like the people who were playing with the telephone at first, you will imagine a room full of women just switching different cables. Well, at this time, it was a bit of the same things. And so women kind of switched from doing the different calculus by hand to doing it with computers. And I think this is really well represented in a movie that you maybe have seen called Hidden Figures, that was from a few years ago, where you really see well this transition. And you have both the representation of like pioneer women, but also the role they played by being able to do these very specific tasks. And then maybe, Flora, you want to pick up on what happened after that.
Yeah, so what you see here is basically the fraction of women in different science, technology, engineering, and math fields throughout the years. And basically, the red curve represents the fraction of women in the field of computer science. So basically, until 1994, which is around here, you have a bit over 35% of women in the field of computer science, and then it starts dropping. And it drops drastically to reach today, at least in France, around 12% of women in the field of computer sciences. And what is crazy is that so first of all, when people tell us, it's always been like this, you can tell with numbers and graphs, it's not true. It hasn't always been the case. We've had way more women in the field of computer science in the past. And also what really happened in the 1980s was the appearance of personal computers. So suddenly we have this myth, first of all, of the computer geek that starts to enter into the game. And most importantly, suddenly computer sciences became a very lucrative field. Until then, it wasn't really the case. And the minute computer science's personal computer started, let's say, appearing, it really became something that suddenly everyone realized that it had a huge potential, and specifically a huge potential in terms of business. And it's actually not the only field in which it's the case. There are a bunch of other fields like obstetrics, for example, that used to be traditionally occupied by women. And then the minute people understood that there was money to be made out of those fields started to be more and more populated by men. So there is really this image of the geek that today is let's say even reinforced. And what is very interesting is when you talk today with women that are today senior leader computer scientists, and that they talk about their experience as students in the 80s, 90s, they seem to report the fact that there was nearly less bias 30, 40 years ago than there is today in computer science schools. Like they were the only women in their classes, but they nearly felt less discriminated than what we can hear today when we talk to young girls that are in computer science field. So it's a very tricky business. What today is maintaining, and it's always a bit hard for us because we're always afraid that when we talk about those issues, we participate in reinforcing those stereotypes, but you still have to raise awareness about them. But what today definitely maintains all of this are a certain amount of stereotypes that we have about what it means to be a computer scientist. We have a very strong imposter syndrome, this idea that the imposter syndrome is what some people may feel when they, for example, would like to become computer scientists, but believe it's too hard for them. Even though they are perfectly skilled, even though they have all the criteria to do it, let's say they fulfill all the criteria to do it, there is going to be this pressure of thinking, okay, I'm not good enough, I'm not geek enough, I'm not smart enough. So this is a very known syndrome that is known to affect girls more than it affects boys in general, and for every field. We also know that what participates in having this, let's say, slow, increasing absence of women in the field is also the fact that there's a whole system, right, of recommendation. When as a manager you recommend an employee for another company, we also know that those recommendations can be biased. But this is true for every field of science and technology in general. But what adds up, let's say there's a worsening factor in AI, which is that we have the sexism of this geek culture, this very trash culture from the internet, which is quite different from what we have in other STEM fields. And that adds kind of a layer, let's say, of aggressivity. And if I can speak for myself, I recently did this for the International Women's Day, 8th of March. I did a live Twitch for Sciences et Avenir, which is this French big scientific journal. And it was amazing because we had over 36,000 people that attended the whole event. But it was, I never experienced this in my whole life. I've been flooded with sexist comments for around an hour and a half. And it was the first time that I was personally exposed to such a wave of pure, free sexism. And I really see that this is something that you would never see, in a conference or whatever. It's like something that is really online that kind of frees this let's say, very sterile hatred. And yeah, so out of all of this picture, we kind of see that AI is mostly populated by men. And our major question was what type of consequences can that have on the pro itself. I know this is a very, let's say, it looks like a negative portrait. I can also talk about all the amazing initiatives that are happening right now. We know a lot of them in France. I think people really understood that this was an issue that had to be solved. And there are amazing initiatives, for example, in the École 42, which is a big school for computer sciences in France, where the head of the institute is now a woman called Sophie Vigier. And she really decided to tackle this. And she did it by implementing a series of, I think, over 40 different actions, because she understood that it's not, it's not just putting women on your website that is going to change it, or like put pink instead of gray on your, even though that probably won't work either. But she really understood that it's a mix of communication, of internal support, of peer support that is actually going to solve the issue.
One comment on the graph you showed before we move to another issue. What I don't understand, but maybe as a man, I don't know, is so the situation was similar to several fields, either computer science, but other scientific fields. You show medical studies, law, and others. So the fact that women were minority in this field was shared, but computer science is the only one where you see actually women leaving the field. So even if more men join and the competition became harsher, why did the women why did they leave the field? Is it because of this?
So I think it's a misunderstanding.
Yes.
Yeah, I think it's not that they left. It's by the proportion that you have, you can imagine that the number of people doing computer science dramatically rose in the last 30 years. So it's a lot, like proportionally, you had a lot less women joining. It's a proportion. It's not that only they left. It's like at the beginning, if you look at computer science studies, if in 1984 you had 35%, then you can look every year at the number of people taking computer science as a major, and you will see that the number of women, it's not like the total number will increase, but the proportion of women will decrease.
But there is still an important number, which is the fact that women have twice higher chances of leaving the field of computer sciences than men throughout their career. So it's not only that they don't join, but they also leave twice.
Yeah, and for this, a lot of a lot of people have blamed also the way the field works and the company works. It's always hard if you are like let's say alone as a woman in a company with 10 men, and the reverse is also true. If you are the only man among 10 women, it will be let's say maybe harder to find your place, to fit in, and maybe at some point you will want to switch. And Flora discussed behaviors of sexism, and there were many. And I think also about peer recognition. This is something that is quite important, meaning how other people in your field view you. And there was an extremely interesting study that was done on a very important platform called GitHub. And GitHub is a platform where you share code, but it's also, I would say, mostly important also for the reputation. It's a platform where pretty much people can somehow tell if the code is good or not by different means. And it was shown that the suggestions that are made on this platform were on average better when they came from women. And this was true, like people would rate his suggestion as better. But the only case where that wasn't true, where this didn't hold, is when the person making the suggestion was self-identifying with her pseudonym, like as a woman. So if your pseudonym would be ASL, like something, whatever, 09, and your woman, your suggestion would be rated on average better than other people. But if this pseudonym was, I don't know, Sarah 903, then it would be rated less. And this is really this kind of small pervasive sexism that kind of little by little would also push women out, because at some point a lot of women would feel underappreciated, undervalued, or just not good enough to stay in the field.
Well, it's terrible. Let's speak about bias. And can you give us some example of bias in AI? And also, can you give us some clue, some explanation how this technology, which we could think is objective because based on mathematics and algorithm, sounds very scientific for most of us, how it can bring some bias in the result and the conclusion.
So I think that in terms of biases, you can go on Google and type sexist, racist biases AI, and there's going to be, you have 10 pages of those examples, some of them, let's say, more or less research in depth. In the book, even though our examples start to be a bit old, like there's a lot of stuff that is still coming out in the previous years, but one of the strong examples is the case of Joy Bolamwini. She was a student from MIT, a black woman, and she was basically working on a facial recognition algorithm. And she rapidly realized that the algorithm was very good to recognize her white male colleagues, but didn't work very well on her own face. And she didn't stop here. She basically decided to understand a bit more what was behind. And what she really put forward was the fact that the reference databases that were used to train the facial algorithms were actually not representative. They were much more populated with faces of white men compared to faces of black women. And so it's just like a kid. If you teach him, if you teach him how to read French with 10 books and how to read Hebrew with one book, he will be much better at reading French than at reading Hebrew. So here it's a bit the same thing. The algorithm was very good at recognizing faces of white men, but not of black women. And here it's still a little bit descriptive, but it can go quite far. There is this case of this girl that has been annotated as a gorilla on Google Photos. So there is a discriminating, it's not just, it's making a mistake. It can go to discrimination. When you're annotating a black person as a gorilla, it's like, and Google still didn't solve the problem technically. They just forbid Google Photo to annotate people as gorilla, but they didn't solve the issue. Right now, we have in the US a lot of cases related to health, where you have algorithms that are used to allocate whether or not what type of treatment patients can get. And we know that, for example, those algorithms are racist. Here it's not a case of gender bias, it's a case of racial bias, where the algorithm has a hard time to disentangle the actual health status of the person from his socioeconomic background. Which shouldn't be the case. You shouldn't take that into account to know whether a person with the same symptoms should have the same type of treatment. And here it's not the case. There are other examples of, I don't know if you want to, recently also, I think it came out 2 days ago or a week ago, case of a job advertisement on Facebook that for the same income, a man and a woman don't have the same job offers. And obviously, the women get job offers for jobs that are less paid, because behind that the algorithm have just learned based on past history that on average for same qualification and same experience, women are paid less. So the algorithm is just reproducing what it learned in the past. So in that case, the algorithm is really reproducing the bias. Maybe Aude, you want to put the table so we can.
Yeah, I will say a few words and then put the table. So Flora gave you a few examples of the biases of algorithms. And one thing we really try to go deep into in the book is what are the different mechanisms. And Flora said the major one that had been described was the biases of the training data sets. But we kind of didn't want to only stop there. So we thought, okay, let's pick an algorithm and understand at each step of building such an algorithm, where can biases come? And the first step when you build an algorithm is to kind of translate the goal of the algorithm into codes and, let's say, mathematical formulas. What I mean is that, let's say you want to have an algorithm that will sort out all the students that apply to a specific program to know which one you take. This is barely rhetorical because in France, currently, to attend university, you apply to programs through this kind of big things called Parcoursup, and they do analyze these things with algorithm. And so how do you define what is the best student? Is it like the best final grade, like let's say to the baccalaureate, or all over the year? Is it the best progression? Is it in specific, let's say, fields, or so one subject, one matter? What is a quota, etc., etc.? And we see that these kind of things are somehow subjective. We might have very different definitions of how we define what is the best student. And so how do we translate it is something that is very important. And this might be easy, and you might have a very strong opinion about what is a best student, but you can imagine that this kind of things would translate to many other complicated problems in how you translate somehow a goal that is a written or an oral will into more code. And it's something that that actually was a bias that we thought would happen. And Flora described a study that that was published last year in Science that actually showed this bias exists. And it was indeed how do you determine the how sick someone is. And because how sick someone is was not based on symptoms, but was based on how much money do you pay for your health per month. This is how you were determined to be sick. Well, you had a bias because on average, white people for the same level of symptoms would spend more on their health. And this is how you get this type of bias. So that's kind of the first step. The second step, Flora described as the training data set, so if it's biased. And I would say the third step is once you have an algorithm that is trained, is how will you choose what is the optimal version of this algorithm? Meaning that you will have error rates. An algorithm will always make mistakes. But, and I think now with the pandemics, people can really understand these concepts better. Do you want more false positives or more false negatives? And of course, these can be different for different population, and maybe the false negatives will impact actually more some population than others. And for this, I want to just give you a quick example, which is an example from Compass. Which is an example from
So basically, it was a study made by Publica, which was interested in an algorithm called Compass. And the goal of Compass was to help judges take decisions regarding regarding people that had been into jail. And basically, Compass was giving a probability that this person in jail would reiterate, would commit another. It would give a ranking. So basically saying, okay, if your score is 10, it means that you have a high probability of committing a new case. Whereas if your score was low, you had a low probability of you were classified as low probability of doing a new offense. And basically, Compass was used by judges to decide for what type of sentences they would give to prisoners. You want to present, Aude, or
no? You can do it.
So here, for example, you have a case of two prisoners. On the left, you have Vernon Prater, who has 2 armed robberies, one grand theft, etc. On the right side, you have Brishna Borden, and her prior offenses are 4 juvenile misdemeanors. So you can see that the difference in the type of offenses that have been done are quite high. You have an attempt of armed robberies, etc. And so now what Compass does is to rate what is the probability that both of those prisoners will commit a new offense. So, for example, for you, how many think that Vernon Prater would be highly likely of committing, like who would be the most likely to commit a new offense? Would it be Vernon Prater or Brishna Borden? Vernon Prater, right? We all believe, based on the information here, that highly likely that Vernon Prater will make a new offense. And if you look at the result of Compass, you can see that Brishna Borden has been classified as high risk, where Vernon Prater has been classified at low risk. So how do we get there? For this, if you can show the following slide, you start with the top part where you see on the left side 6 white prisoners, and on the white side 6 black prisoners, or 10, sorry, my bad, 10. And on the top, you see how many of them are classified at high risk. And for a bunch of socioeconomic reasons, it's true that on average, Black people in the US have higher chances of committing offenses than white people, at least in this specific case. So until then, there's no biases here. The fact that twice as many people in the black population are thought to commit, are classified as high risk than the white population. Up until there, it's just a very bad consequence of socioeconomic status, but there's no bias at this point. The problem is that algorithms make mistakes, and what you see is that, for example, in the red box here on the left side, you can see that indeed those two people have redone an offense. So the algorithm predicted the reiteration of an offense correctly. But in this case, the algorithm predicted that prisoner would commit an offense, but it didn't. So this is what we call a false positive, right? This prisoner was positively thought to commit an offense again, but he didn't. And we also have false negatives, where this prisoner that was that was not classified as high risk finally did it. So mistakes happen. And what you see here is that, and this is what ProPublica basically put forward, is that the false positives, so people that have been wrongly assigned as high risk, is basically twice as high as in the black population compared to the white population, right? You have two absolute, two false positives in the black population compared to one false positive. And they said, this is a scandal. You tend to make mistakes, to accuse falsely twice as many black people compared to white people. And then what the designers of the algorithm said was, no, absolutely not. We are not biased at all. In both cases, we made a third of mistakes. In both of cases, we made a mistake in 1 out of 3, right? 1 out of 3 on one side, 2 out of 6. So the proportion of mistakes is the same. And the problem is that we don't really know who's right or wrong. Like, in fact, they are right on the algorithm side. The rate of their mistake is the same. It's just that in terms of absolute population, it concerns twice as many people. So what is fair? And then in the following slide, we see that what is fair is actually not so obvious. There is a whole course by this scientist called Aviv Narayanan, which is called 21 Definition of Fairness. Because what is a fair algorithm is actually not so obvious, and it's in general a combination of both political and social definition, but it's really not something that is so clear.
And so if I can just conclude on this part, this is a bit of a scary table, but don't worry, there won't be a quiz at the end. It's just, for us, it was a way to kind of try to formalize a bit what we had described with, like, the building steps here on the left of an algorithm, the biases that can impact them, and the potential consequences. And then I'll take a second. So you see, define the objective. We all have our biases, our unconscious stereotype. The train and optimize the biased data set, the evaluation, the definition of equity. And we didn't get into it, but for the product, the fact that we reuse code over and over again can propagate biases very fast without really realizing it, because you're already using some sort of biased basis. And the nice kind of things is that for all of these things, you do have solutions. And that maybe, I guess, where we're getting at, right?
Yeah, it's good. Let's talk about solutions. So, like big software companies, they have a lot of resources. Do they have the technical means to analyze their algorithm, trying to the flaws in order to make them less biased? I've read some cases where even when going through this process, the final algorithm is still, or even sometimes even more biased than the original. Like technically, how can we bring some solution?
So it depends for which problem, but for example, in the case of the biased database, actually quite around the time that we published the book, IBM published a kind of reference imaging data set in which they really tried to have a data set that was representative of the different population that the algorithm would be targeted to. So if you design a facial algorithm that is supposed to work at an airport, it's important that the training data set has as many women as men and representative populations of who your algorithm is actually going to encounter, let's say, or at least be trained on. So in their case, big company releases this big database, they have the technical means. I'm sure also what we often say is that AI is a field that advances very quickly. So it means that we find out about problems very fast and we find out about solutions very fast. So it does go fast. I don't think that technical is not the limitation. I think political is the limitation. For example, I don't know if you've heard about what happened with Google and this computer scientist called Timnit Gebru, where she was, I don't think she was heading, but she was working in the Department of Ethics, and she wanted to publish a paper showing that one of the Google algorithm was biased. And she got fired. Basically, they asked her, don't publish the paper. She wanted to publish it, and they fired her. So, Google can make a lot of statements about how they want to be fair and transparent, but the minute it touches their core, somehow it seems that the best way is just to erase it. And what I found very problematic with this case is that if it were a small company, we would probably all say, okay, let's just boycott it. Like we just all moved from WhatsApp to Signal, right? And we said, we don't want to be on WhatsApp anymore. But Google, they fired their main researcher in ethics, and we are still all using Gmail. And this is where I find it very worrying, is that they have so much power that we don't even have the means to push back. And this is where probably the state and regulation and norms have to enter, because sometimes it seems that, at least for big companies, for a long time, the best mechanism for them to correct those biases was pressure from us, from customers, right? But it seems that this power has limits, and this is why I think we're at a time where calling on Twitter and on Facebook that they have biases in their algorithm is not enough anymore, and you need regulation.
And if I can add something, I think we always say that with Flora that the solutions are both humans and technicals. You need to have technical solutions that are developed, and it's great because you have amazing researchers, both in the public and private sector, who are working on that subject and who are making progress. It's not as easy as one could think, as like, yeah, let's fix the databases and there won't be any more biases. We're basically wanting from algorithm to succeed where we failed. We are a biased society, and we want algorithms to pretty much learn about our society, take decision for us, but not make the same mistakes. So what we could call degenderizing, like removing it's almost impossible. So it is hard, but there are ways to make progress, and there are also ways to control that your algorithm doesn't impact negatively a specific population. So I think that's extremely important, and more than of course, it's super hard to be absolutely perfect, but it needs to be at least a factor that is taken in consideration, as much as I would say it's kind of a new definition of how efficient an algorithm can be, meaning that it needs to be efficient for most of the population and not just a subpopulation. So that's one thing. The second thing is that very recently, meaning last week, the European Union has actually announced that they would issue new regulations, I would say groundbreaking regulations regarding these subjects in the next few years, where they will require that the companies who sell algorithms will have to kind of follow very specific things for different types of data. And notably, they classify some of these data and algorithm as high risk, such as facial recognition within a public space. And for this, the companies will have regulations that they have to meet with regards to biases. And this is also the case, for example, for self-driving cars and a few other topics like this one. So I guess like Europe and the European Union has been very forward and very good at making new regulations. At least they are innovating in that respect. And they had made a lot of, I would say, amazing regulation within public data and personal data and this. And now it's great to see that regarding ethics in AI and this kind of things, they are also kind of leading the way, I would guess.
So you both believe that public public institution and government or international organization involvement is necessary in order to regulate this field. It can't come from internally from the private sector, even with because there are some lot of commercial impact on all of this. So it should be in the interest of the companies to make their product more efficient.
So in a way, and this you can zoom out from AI, right? But let's take the case of a specific medication that are tested for many years in the laboratory on male rats, and then the male mice, and then when you put them on the market, you realize that those medicines have a much higher impact, secondary effect on women than they have on men, because they have never been tested on the female mice. So you would expect that, you know, the companies would say, oh wow, there's a huge market. If we start testing those medication on female mice, we're going to open a new area. Nothing happens. So, you know, the minute there is enough money to make by making algorithms that kind of seem to make a lot of money right now, why change? Who cares that it's discriminating half of the population? This is already the case for many years in many fields. So I'm kind of thinking that no, it's somehow, because it's not visible, right? Because it's a bit of a hidden bias. We don't really, you know, tackle it up front because it's a bit hidden. So yeah, I think that it's the role of the state to, or even regulation or UNESCO or whatever you name it, but to put those issues up front and to say it's not because we don't see it that it doesn't happen. And it's already, I think, for example, there's been a very nice, interesting case study on biases of recruitment algorithms for Sciences Po, where they had a specific algorithm that basically recruited students based on the average grades over the year, which was a bit problematic because we know that different high schools have different grading systems, and the end line was that étudiants boursiers, like students that had students on scholarship tended to be discriminated against with that system for no reason. But who cares? You know, it's like, it's only if you care about justice that you care about those issues. And I don't think that companies always care about justice. And this is where it's the role of the state to put that up front.
And if I can add something, I don't think most of the things should come from only government or external things. I think that's why Flora and I were also really into raising awareness. I think all the citizens should be aware of this, because you will be faced in your life as a citizen to automatic decisions. And a lot of people are not aware that when you say it's an automatic decision, a lot of people will kind of think it's not biased because it was taken by a computer, and maths are absolutely objective and not subjective. And us as scientists, we know that science is biased. We know that math can be biased. And so in that way, it's kind of our responsibility to have people be aware that when they are faced with this kind of decisions, you have chances the same way that when you are faced with a human who's taking a decision about yourself, well, that human can be biased. And actually, the automated decision can be too. And having a lot of people be aware of this will be ways to keep challenging when these biases are evident or not. And I think it was wonderful to see for a lot of, Flora just mentioned Sciences Po Bordeaux, and I think it was Bordeaux, whatever, but for a lot of things, you start seeing like people digging into one very specific example around them. You start seeing also people kind of student associations, they challenge to get access to the code of the algorithm that chooses which university students go to. And I think all these kind of citizen-driven initiatives have a lot of chances of actually succeeding and kind of raising awareness at different stages, from like very big companies to actually small algorithms that will be used in daily life. So I think that's extremely important too.
In a way, you could see this as a parallel to the environmental issues. Let's say, as a customer, you will start asking about where the products come from and what is behind, and you will start checking on your app how much has it traveled and how much has it produced, and you will take your decision based on that. And hopefully one day people will have enough tools in hand to actually be able to take an informed decision and say, no, I don't want to get a credit from that bank because I know that their credit allocation algorithm has been shown to be biased, so I can take another decision and go to a bank that has a fair algorithm. And this is why we need labels also, I guess, to evaluate.
Yes, because where can the general public find this information? It's also another question. Yeah. And something interesting you said, and also quite surprising for a non-expert, is basically you said it looks scientific, or it looks like science, but it's not fair. But in the in the political speech, in the political debate, very often science, and we saw it within the COVID-19 crisis, science is always put forward to explain things and convince the public that it's either true or fair and
but good scientists during the pandemic told you, I'm sorry, I don't
so
know.
it's also confusing for the public at the end. Thank you for we already covered quite a range of the issue. I think I turn to the public here in the room, and if anyone wants to ask a question to our panelists, please raise your hand. We have very few, so I think. Yes.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for this fascinating presentation. I am absolutely not an expert, but I have two questions. To begin with, I was really intrigued by your approach to what you call the food soldiers. I'm wondering whether there was a transformation in the nature of the profession, especially in terms of qualification. Meaning, do you think that in the beginning of, like in the 20th century, there was more unskilled or less skilled and qualified workers than now? And the other question is, to what extent can algorithm not only replicate, reproduce discriminations, but also break like bad habits? And can algorithms be used in affirmative action? That's what we call discrimination activity.
Yes, I think it's the last chapter of the book, so you could written it first.
Sorry,
I'll start with the second one.
I'm going to.
So yeah, absolutely. It's the part that in general we don't have time to reach because we talk about all the problems.
Thank you for the question.
So that's great. Yeah, so actually what we try also to show in the last part and in general is that, okay, so it's a great tool as we see that it's full of bias, but now we also spend our time saying it's an amazing tool that can do lots of stuff. So how can we use it, as you say, exactly for affirmative action? So there are several ways. I think that, for example, a very concrete way is that today people are using algorithms to, let's say, detect potential candidates for a job offer, right? And imagine that you are looking for a candidate for a technical job or a computer science job. You can very easily code into your algorithm that you want at least 50% of female and male CVs that come up. It doesn't necessarily need to be representative of the pool, right? Because the pool of candidates is technically still biased. You will have maybe 20, best of cases, 30% of women that apply, but you can decide to do something affirmative, and you can decide to do it for any type of minority, by the way, or not minority, because women are not minority, but you can decide to encode this, and it's just one line in a piece of code to say, okay, just look at all the CVs on LinkedIn that correspond to what I am looking for, but I will add just one condition that I want at least the same amount of men and female CV that come up. So this would be a case where you're really using it to, in a way, this time you're not using AI to represent reality, you're using it to change reality. But also we think that AI is an amazing tool to put numbers on things, because we are also, as scientists, strong believers that people start getting that there's a problem when they see numbers. And AI, for example, has been used to look at presence on screens of men and women in major blockbusters in the US. So they basically took, I think, 500 movies, and Google did it, of course, and they analyzed the presence on the screen and the amount of time that the women basically spoke. And what came out was that on all those movies, women tend to speak 30% of the time and appear on the screen 30% of the time. And this really showed that, even in your blockbusters, even in a movie, it's a movie, even there, the representation is biased. And it did have a small effect. There's a certain number of producers that said, wow, I didn't realize. Because most of the time you just don't realize. It's not we don't think that there's this conspiracy that makes producers that want to put women off the screen. It's completely unconscious. And so there are a few producers that said, okay, I realize that and I will be careful next time. So in this case, AI is used to basically collect a lot of data, analyze it, this time in an unbiased way, and to show the truth, with a lot of numbers. And this, of course, can help to raise awareness. We also have one very interesting case on Wikipedia. For example, on Wikipedia, we know that around 90% of the contributions are coming from men. but also that if you look at biographies on Wikipedia, 90%, at least until recently, a vast majority of biographies on Wikipedia were biographies of men. As if, men made history, they made geography, they made science. So, because Wikipedia now is such a big source of information, but it's not true. You have tons of women in history that have contributed to science and technology. And here, there's this organization that basically used AI to automatically create tons of biographies on Wikipedia of women by harvesting a lot of information from the web. And then, it's the role of Wikipedia contributors to augment those pages, but at least the pages were created. So now they're there. They're not invisible anymore. So it can also be very useful to do this kind of very, high throughput automated approach. Yeah.
And if I can just add something, the way we kind of summarize this is, it can be good if the algorithms are biased. It's just it's depending the source and the direction of the bias. Like somehow, if you can bias it in your sense of society, like how you define what you want society to look like, it might be either to change a few lines of codes than changing a lot of mentalities. So you can kind of not like thinking that you can use kind of these tools to really forward your vision of what society should look like. I guess you had the second question, the first question actually on the foot soldiers and the relations to skills. It's an interesting question. I guess for me, it's a really cool skill to be able to calculate a lot of stuff and program. But maybe at that point, it was not seen as a very important skill or as something skilled. So I'm not doing sociology, or I don't know which fields of study would look at this type of thing, this story maybe. But I think it would be very interesting to see how these type of skills were perceived and how that evolved. And probably this would impact a lot the proportion of women and men that played in this field. Because this has been demonstrated over and over again that in scientific field, where you believe that something is super hard and you need to be excellent and a genius, you will have more men. If it's supposed to be super serious work where no brain is required, just being super meticulous, you will have more women. That's how it works. So I guess if that's what you were pointing, I think it's a very interesting question, and I don't have clear data on this. I don't know if you have, Flora.
No.
Une question en français.
Yeah, bien sûr.
Donc, moi, je suis ingénieur en informatique et j'ai une question sur les questions des biais. Moi, je vois que c'est de la politique. Qu'est-ce que vous pouvez commenter là-dessus? Parce que les bias ont changé et finalement, c'est des choix de la société, ce sont des choix politiques et aujourd'hui, ils sont tels que là, mais dans 20 ans, ça sera encore autre chose. Et donc, vouloir corriger les biais dans des bases de données ou, comme a dit, en changeant quelques lignes de code, en orientant les résultats, finalement, par rapport à une analyse extrêmement technique, par exemple, en intelligence artificielle, de reconnaître des cancers, par exemple, dans des radios où là, c'est une vérité qui s'exprime physique. Et voilà, comment vous pouvez commenter ça? In English, no.
Yeah, so the question was basically how that kind of correcting the biases is something political.
Yeah.
Like you're making a difference between. So, for example, I would say that in the case of tumor recognition on histology, we know that it's something that the database can also play a big role there, right? If you have only pictures of white skin and black skin. So here, I think that in this case, we would all agree that it's the fair thing to do is to guarantee equal efficiency of your algorithm for all the diverse population, right? So I think that in the case of health, it's quite easy to say that the good thing to do is to fix the bias. At least this is my personal opinion. But then what you're asking is to bias the algorithm to have more women CVs when I'm looking for a candidate. You're saying like to change reality, basically. You're questioning that. Yeah, so I think this is what I was saying. It boils down to what you want. What do you want your society to look like? And for me, it's mostly a matter of equal access to opportunity in that case, or going to school or getting a credit at the bank, or it's just equal access to opportunity. And for me, this is the driving political intention that you should have.
You are describing democracy.
Yeah.
In China, it's not the
No,
way
exactly.
that
Absolutely.
they are going, and
Absolutely.
there are a lot of people there.
Yeah, absolutely. But this is why I'm very afraid of Chinese algorithm in general, because I don't think they are working for the greater good. They are working for greater control. But at least in the case of, let's say, France, or I hope Israel, I would guess that the ultimate goal is to have, amazing tools that mostly are here to reduce inequalities and guarantee equal access to opportunity. So this is why I would consider that in a way, you say that we're biasing in the other way, but what I see is that we've been living in a biased society for the past 2,000 years, maybe not, but let's say at least in the 50, 100 last years, the default has been the bias. And now what we are saying when we're suggesting to bias the algorithms towards the other side is just to put the cursor back in the middle. We're not going other extreme. We're just asking to put it back where it would guarantee equal access to everyone.
But if I can add something, I find it very interesting, because I agree with you if we say it's okay to bias algorithm within the regard of the society we want. If we're not in a democracy, that's a very risky move. And so if we assume that we can do it that way in our society, we have to kind of go to the end of this saying and assume that, China is using it in the way they want society to look like. And I guess for a lot of us, that's very scary. I was in China like a year and a half ago, just before the pandemic started. And I was so shocked. They're like so good in a very scary manner at AI. Like you cannot go anywhere without, they know everywhere you go, even if you don't. And that's something we are not used as, I guess, Europeans. And that's very scary. And I don't know how people will be able to deal with that. I have no idea.
We have a few more comments and questions on the Q&R, and thanks all of you who took the time to write your question. I pick two. One is it's a comment and a question. It's going back to the disinterest or the lack of women in the field. You spoke at the beginning of the session. Tammy is asking whether we could explain this because of the time the time available to women in order to cope with the demand of this field. When after it became more lucrative, it became more time consuming, and because of the lack of balance or equality between men and women on the time availability, especially in couples. Could you explain the fact that a number of women left the field and left it to men? And a question from Galit, asking whether you are referring in your book works from Catherine Hales, My Mother Was a Computer, or Sadie Plant's Zeros and Ones. Are they works you know about?
I want to read them now, but no, we didn't say them. I love the title, so I'll definitely check them. Thank you for these references.
Of works close to yours, Catherine Hales, My Mother Was a Computer, and Sadie Plant's Zeros and Ones. Is there another question from the room? Maybe because we almost consume our time. I'd like to ask you one last question, maybe in order to, before we close the event. You spoke about the public acceptance and the public involvement on this issue, and how actually we should play a role in all of this in order to make changes. So what would be your suggestion? What can we do as an individual in order to either as a woman or a man, if we are concerned with the problem, with the issue, what can we do? I mean, it's other issue. It's not like using plastic cup. This one is.
Yeah, I have a few ideas. So I think whenever you think you have an automatic decision, question it, like in a systematic manner. You go to a school and they're like, yeah, we had so many CVs, blah. How did you, not CVs, but like student applying. How did you choose it? Are you using an algorithm? You know how to use it. When you are faced without unemployment, are you using an algorithm to, like, I ask all the time. And I think like already asking and seeing the type of answer you get is already something very important. And then you have associations. So you can always join associations. I really encourage people to do this kind of work. If you want to check it out, there is this association from Joy Bulawini. So this is international. It's called the Algorithm Justice League. So it's an association that deals with this kind of issues. You can also check, bring your support to student association who are questioning Parcoursup if you want this kind of things. The EU will now issue a lot of regulations. So just, I think as an individual, a lot of the work we have to do is just talking about these subjects around like drinking a beer, drinking coffee, having dinner, just bringing them up. And most of the time we realize that people don't know a lot about them, and just like speaking about it and making more people aware, that's like easy to do for everyone. And you were mentioning about plastic cups and things. I think, again, for this, the more we talk about these subjects, the better. So like, I don't think it's very hard for an individual to just bring it up and just listen to the news. And you'll see when you start listening to the news about that, about like in general, and you have that subject in mind, you'll see it will come up repeatedly. There are always questions about, do I use my phone? It has a facial recognition. What is done with this kind of things? What rights do I have? What do with the face? Is it, if you have a phone, like, does it recognize me better or someone else? What about my voice? Do I use a woman or man voice on my GPS? Why am I more comfortable myself with a woman or man voice giving me orders? Or if you use things like Alexa or Siri, have you ever thought that it's only women and that it can transmit a submissive type of aspect to things? I think just start questioning ourselves, our habits, and whenever we are confronted to some form of AI, thinking about this subject is already like more than enough to do and be proactive on this. I don't know if you have other suggestions.
Yeah, on my personal side, for example, we're always, you're always very excited when there's a new startup doing stuff in AI. You're like, oh, wow, like startup plus AI, it must be something new. And it's true that in this case, I also think, okay, does this product touch women and men? And if yes, does it make a difference? And this is in general the two questions that I ask myself, and it can be about a car, it can be about a new app, it can be about a new device that helps us to sleep better. It's always, I'm thinking, when the people behind, when the team designed this product, did they consciously ask whether or not it could make a difference, whether or not it's being applied to a man or a woman? Let's say this is on the product side. And I would say there's the other side also, which is how can you encourage the participation of more diversity in those scientific and technology fields in general. So it's not just in AI. I think in all fields of science and technology, I mean, each and one of us, with our sisters, with our nieces, with our daughters, we can encourage them to be more interested in those fields. It doesn't mean that they need to become scientists, but to decrease the barrier of interest, because the more people will be, let's say, scientifically educated, the higher the chances that later on we will ask questions about it, we will be more comfortable manipulating those concepts that are going to be everywhere. And I think that the best service you can give to a young girl today is to teach her how to code, or to break the barrier that can exist between her and the field of science in general, because it's going to be so, yeah.
And I fully agree with that with Flora. There are amazing gifts. Now people really developed super cool gifts and tools and games and whatever that really promote these kind of things. And
our goal is not to have all girls turning into science, of course not, but we do see that there is this kind of more easy appetite, you know, in young boys towards science. Again, it doesn't mean that we'll become scientists, but they will be more tech savvy in general. And we really want to try and equilibrate this a bit more, that all of us basically have the same capacity to pick on new tools, to pick on new concepts, because this is what will be very useful for them to manipulate their environment in the future. Yeah.
So you're rather optimistic.
Yes,
about
always.
The trend.
Yes.
Always. I think you cannot be an activist in this kind of fields for something like 8 years and be pessimistic.
We're pessimistic in the reality, you know. It's the picture that we paint is not nice, but it's full of opportunities. So.
But does it mean that since you started to care about the problem and to investigate, and have things improved?
Yes, no, I would say yes. I mean, we started to be involved in gender equality subjects in 2012, 2013. What the Me Too movement have done is incredible. Like the way like that people are now okay to discuss a lot of topics on gender equality and are more ready to hear and more ready to acknowledge that this is true. It's for me, I've seen a drastic shift around this. Like I think, it really changed everything, and not only on the exact, like when you think of Me Too about the harassment stories and everything. This is one part of the consequences of Me Too, but the other is really that I guess for a lot of the people dealing with gender equality in general, and for us in very technical subjects like the one we study. It changed a lot. So yes, things improved. It's now a topic that people talk about.
Well, and thanks to you, it's a topic we're also learning a lot. So thank you very much for giving us such a great presentation with especially such a deep resources and examples. It helps to better understand and figure out what the problem is for non-specialists. Except if unless there is a very last question for our two panelists. Thank you very much for joining us for our first physical event. I mean hybrid, but also physical event. And we'll try to now do more. Thank you very much to all of you who joined on Zoom. We'll close our session today, and I'm telling you we don't know when, but we hope to settle very soon a new session on AI and ethics next June. And please look at the website to keep you informed about the date. Thank you, Flora. Thank you, Aude. And I wish you good luck in your activities. And we all hope to try to also take some personal action in order to fix some of these issues. But at least thank you very much for giving us some tools to better react and also better act, in order not to reproduce ever and ever those kind of bias. Thank you very much, and see you soon. Have a good night.
Bye, Aude.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Merci.